basically the way this is going to work, we will be running sprints throughout this. So we're going to talk the whole time. You can mute us if you don't want to hear our random banter. There's certainly the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that. There will be some delay though. So if we don't immediately get to anything that's coming up there, please know either that's because we're in the middle of something, or we just haven't seen it yet, or we have seen it and time is a flat circle and all that. So that'll be going on. While we're doing that, we will be running sprints. So you'll see a nice little timer at the bottom, which will give you a sense of how long the sprint is going to be. We're going to do 15-minute sprints, followed by 5 minutes of taking a little brain break. You can check in with the chat, check in with the video. Feel free to post your word count if you want to get some like high fives from us and from the folks in the chat. Alternatively, if you just want to quietly do your thing and just listen for the sprints, totally fine. And also, if you'd like to submit questions for this, we're going to try and pick a question every week that seems like it's got some wide-ranging implications and unpack that. So we've got a Google link that you can check out and submit your questions there. But otherwise, yeah, that's going to be the basic format. Unpacking one major issue per episode. We're also running some sprints. And again, we'd love to hear how you feel about it. If you got thoughts and all that sort of stuff, please let us know, because we're going to be changing it up as it goes along. So without further ado, why don't we get right to it? And sort of start off the very first sprint. So once again, the way sprints work, if you haven't done them before, is it's just an excuse to make your brain say, okay, I got to write for 15 straight minutes. So don't worry too much about your word count. Don't worry about whether it's good or not. And if you stare at a blinking cursor for 15 minutes, don't worry. That's actually writing too. That's your brain sorting through all the various things you're trying to get up and over. So don't worry about how much or how little you write. Just high five yourself for taking the time, making the time, and forcing yourself to try it. So without further ado, Nick, if you can hit go in the first sprint, Nick is going to have eyes on this. He's gesturing broadly.
It has been done.
It has been done. Go, go, go. Sprint
there is
live.
A timer. 15 minutes of writing.
You, whoever you are, I bet you're going to kill it, and I'm real proud of you. So good luck with your writing. And now we're going to talk a little bit more. So once again, my name is Tom. Some of you may know me from Stars, where I worked in education for a while. My new job here at Wattpad is in content development and trying to help stories really reach their full potential. You've probably heard me say time and time again things about creating the best version of your story possible. And that's what matters kind of the most to us, is that the story that you're creating is your story. And we're going to give you suggestions and ideas, and we hope they're useful. But if they aren't, that's also totally fine. It's your story, and you'll know what's best for it. So that's me. Nick, I'm going to throw it over to you to introduce yourself. I know a lot of the folks here will know you, but for those who don't, here's Nick.
Yes, I'm Nick. I got this sweet side camera energy that I got to talk to, but then also because I have this ridiculous, everything's set up and sitting on my computer, so I got to watch it all here and also here, so I can talk to the people. Continuing things over from, I suppose, the Road to Waddies podcast, really, is this kind of like a spiritual successor. We were trying a lot to help people in that one, but the problem with the Road to Waddies one is like it's contained within the Waddies. We can only explain the Waddies so many times and ways, and so that content will live forever. People can always listen to those podcasts and understand stuff, but with this, hopefully we can be way more interactive, which is something that I'm really looking forward to, because this is how people would know me. Like, I have been a part of content development in some way or form at Wattpad for a very long time. I'm the director of content, so like if it's content related, it probably touched me in some degree, or I saw it. It passed my desk. Maybe that's the best way to put it. It passed through my desk at some point, and so I kind of watch over all of this stuff at this point. But one of my favorite things to always do was interacting with the community and just being in there and helping people with advice. I used to run like story labs, things like that, where people would submit summaries. I fully expect people will want to submit summaries, and so long as they're okay with us bringing them up live on air, I would happily go through people's summaries, all that kind of stuff, to do things. So that covers me as well, and I suppose we need to get into the first question, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just one sort of last note on us and the way this is going to work. Today you've got the two of us. Probably next week you'll have the two of us, but we won't be the only people on this. We're going to rotate people through. Yeah, Nick may peace out and just leave me to my fate. I might reveal I'm 3 kids in a trench coat, and then Nick will have to take over. Anything's possible on StorySights. But we're going to have different experts on to talk about different things throughout. So it's us today. It won't always just be us, but that's part of the fun evolution of this, because we want to make sure that we're giving you exposure to all the different experts we've got here at Wattpad, and different perspectives, different experiences, and different voices. So for now, it's us. Won't always be us, but today it's us. So
Yeah.
without further ado, Nick, we got our very first question, which made us very happy, because of course one of the stressful things about starting a live stream where you answer questions on air is that maybe no one will
This is
submit a
having no
question.
questions. Yeah, that's
And
true.
then it'll just be us talking about manga for an hour. But
That's
luckily, someone did submit a question. So Nick, take us away.
Yeah, someone submitted a question. I know that we're on like a 30-second-ish delay, maybe 15 seconds. So try and keep up in chat. So if you type in chat, right, we are reading it. We have it open. Let me do this. There. So it's here. Where I can see it. And Tom's got an even faster version. So Tom's watching it on his screen too. So if you post stuff in here, we will try and get to it. I say that because there's an interactive component even to this question in terms of the answer. Thanks to, there it is. Thanks, of course, to this magical question coming in. There we go. So what genre has the fewest completed stories? Which has the most? And the crux of the question, of course, is like, should we write a story in a popular genre or try a smaller one? And so props to this question. I had to go dig up the answer. I thought that I had it. Turned out I didn't. I have not told you this answer, Tom, so you have no idea what the answer is.
It's true. I'm waiting in suspense and excitement and anticipation.
And so I kind of I put this over to chat as well. If chat wants to throw in their guesses on this one. So this is genre in the traditional Wattpad sense. So like the little drop down menu that you can pick from. So not like steampunk, not a genre that I know it's a tag and I know it's a subgenre, but not one of those genres. So if people want to write in which one has the fewest and which one has the most. And for extra spice, I did it as a measurement of their relative size. So the obvious answer would be like, oh, most of the content is fanfiction, so fanfiction has the, but it has to be relative to their size. How many completed stories do they have, basically, right? So like, if 30% of all the stories are of X genre, but only 10% of the completed stories are also in X genre, that would be very bad, basically. It would be very small. So Tom, while everyone thinks about their answers or writes them into the side here, like, what do you think? Most completed, least completed?
I'm gonna say most completed is YA romance.
That's not a genre. You got to pick one. It's either teen fiction. Okay, so teen fiction, right? Teen fiction. Yeah.
I'm gonna say least completed is. I'm gonna go with sci-fi.
Sci-fi. Okay. So we got most completed teen fiction, least completed sci-fi. Good guesses. Solid guesses. So the most completed is romance, right? Mm-hmm. Most completed is, most of them, by the way, are like within the range of, like, they're almost 0%. Basically, there's no difference between the size of their relative size. But romance is a plus 4%. There's like more stories are finished within romance. In terms of the least completed, teen fiction is the least completed genre. Yeah. So a lot of people start in teen fic. A lot of people write teen fic because they are younger at that time. They're writing it because they are a teen. They're maybe not as serious about it when they start it. All of those can be potential answers. There's a lot of abandoned teen fiction, basically, is what the answer is. Relative to its size. That's an important thing to remember. So relative to its size. And I know that some people... Go for it, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, there's also something to the idea that in a lot of teen fiction, you're dealing with often the start of a relationship, which is where a lot of the meat of those stories is. The chemistry, the build up to it, whether it's enemies to lovers or anything else. And those stories can often be hard to finish because it's easy to imagine, oh, what if this character fell in love with this character? Wrap in all the, heightened emotions of being a teenager and first time experiences and all that sort of stuff. But then you're just kind of left with like, okay, but where does it go? So very easy to burn into that, being like, yes, I've got great momentum. I'm very excited about what I'm writing. Also very easy to go, oh no, now they're just people dating in a school.
Yeah, and I know in the chat, in our lovely chat here, that one of the things was guessed at was horror was another one that came up as like a least completed. Horror is the second most completed given its size. So there you go. And there's a very special reason for that, which is that horror is the shortest genre of all of the genres. So it has the most amount, again, relative for its size, of shorter stories in it. And those are all finished, right? It's people finishing short horror stories. That makes sense, basically.
Well,
So the
also
horror is kind of a cheat.
Yeah, but I mean, also horror to some extent operates like a punchline, right? Like when you're creating a horror story, you're usually imagining what the climax is going to be, the reveal of the monster or the killer. How does the, whether it's a final girl scenario or anything else, how do our characters overcome it? So I know as a writer, it's like a sneeze that you haven't sneezed. It's real hard to start building atmospheric horror and then just be like, nah, I'm cool.
Yeah.
Just eats
Yeah.
at you.
So yeah, but horror is one of those. That's the fun of data, right? Like it would make you think like, oh, maybe everyone in horror like really writes to the end, and it's like, nope, it's because they actually write like less than 10,000 word stories, basically.
Yeah. So one of the part of the reason we're focusing so much on completion is one of the stats Nick found fairly recently was that one of the number one indicators of success or things that drives you towards success as a writer on Wattpad is just completing your story. And I know everyone here has had the experience of finding that awesome Wattpad story that you're all about. You're getting in there, you're really excited, and then there's like update coming soon. And as someone who has a story that said update coming soon for the last 2 years, like I'm guilty of this too.
Me too.
But
Me too.
it makes it hard to commit, right? It's the same thing with on TV when you find out a series got canceled before getting a series finale. Do you really want to commit to that series? Because, so all that to say, completion's a huge part, but we also know that motivation to just get through, particularly in times like these, can be very difficult. And that's part of the reason we're doing this and doing the sprints. Speaking of, by my count, you should probably have, 1 or 2 minutes remaining on the sprint?
5 minutes remaining on the sprint.
5 minutes! Oh,
5 minutes.
the world is your oyster. Nick, we've got a question in the chat about mystery. Where does mystery fall?
Oh my goodness. I can't possibly answer all of the like, what about this one? What about this one? Like I said, almost all the rest of them are like less than 1% close to each other. Science fiction, though, is the second least completed. So you do win that one, I guess. Consolation prize in that regard. If they just want to talk like relative size of the genre, mystery's pretty not like insignificant. Mystery makes up about 5% of all the content, so it's not insignificant. If you want just like the flat number of, or I guess I'll address this to chat. If you want just like the flat number of the raw number of smallest amount of completed stories, it's vampire, which is just a very small genre. So it's kind of unfair. That's why I had to do it in a relative sense.
I would also say mystery falls in the same ballpark as horror, where creating a mystery as a writer, you want to get to the prestige, you want to get to the reveal. Otherwise, it's not nearly as fun because you've come up with something cool and no one has got to experience the cool thing you came up with. To sci-fi, want to guess what genre the story that I haven't completed is in?
It's sci-fi.
It's sci-fi. But sci-fi weirdly operates much the same way as teen fic in terms of creating a science fiction world and introducing your reader to it and the nuance and the world craft and everything else. Is very exciting up front, but then once it's up and running, that's when you hit the real slog, and it can get a lot harder. Also because you're often having to weave that exposition in throughout. If the characters go to a new world with a new society and new civilization, you got to hit the brakes, kind of spend some time explaining that. And as has been mentioned in the chat, also not a genre that the audience for it is much smaller on Wattpad right now, and as a result, it's not there's not as much get up and go from readers being like, but I need to know what happens when they get to Zondor Prime.
Yes, this is very true. This is very true. Sci-fi, horror, and mystery are three of the genres that I use in interviews with users, because a lot of people, when you interview them and ask them like, what do you like to read, they will say like, I like everything. I like everything. And so immediately my answer is like, oh, okay, so you like sci-fi, you read horror. And very quickly they're like, well, I would never read horror. No, I'm not into sci-fi. I'm like, so not everything. And then I use mystery as the next one, and it keeps narrowing it until they're like, well, I read all romance stories. I'm like, okay, well, that helps me better understand. Or I read fantasy and paranormal and all that kind of stuff, but they draw a weird hard line there. I think another important thing, though, that, and this is before we get to the final part of this question, is that, like, as you said, through a lot of my research, like, the most popular stories don't really gain most of their readership until they are complete, to a point that it's so ludicrous how quickly they gain those reads once they're finished, that I'm really confident. I still haven't determined this. I'm really confident that people have to know. Like, there's just no way they can't know that the story was just finished. And the only way they could know that is like if they have it in their library. So I think if you're writing, and you're writing even in a smaller genre like science fiction, and you're saying it's really hard to complete it because I don't have the reads, you're going to be stuck in a vicious cycle because you won't get the reads until you complete it. So if you're waiting on reads in order to finish, you won't get those reads until they're never coming, basically, and you're never going to finish. So finish first, read second. Generally speaking, people will pick up on your story as it goes along and maybe just add it to their reading list and not read it. And that's not a bad thing. That just means probably they're going to read it when it finally finishes. So that's a better way to gauge interest, is just knowing that you have a couple of reading list ads than religiously watching your read count. That's what I would recommend. But, okay, the crux of this question was, of course, should you write a story in a popular genre like romance, or should you try your hand at a smaller one like science fiction, and basically that kind of big fish, small pond situation? I'm curious for the Tom thoughts, but...
Yeah, sorry, I
go.
thought you were on such a roll. I was
No.
I'm waiting for the answer too. I was just reading the chat.
You also have 1 minute before the sprint ends, and I have to make a noise or something at that time.
Oh no! Okay, so yeah, in a nutshell, I think generally speaking, this is a tough one to answer. We are always trying to figure out ways to help you as writers. Game the system is perhaps the wrong term, but game the system in order to build those audiences and build those reads. But unfortunately, as you'll all know from the way you consume stories and watch things and listen to things, readers will determine what they dig and what they enjoy. And for me, the one thing that we always find is stories that have that spark of enjoyment from the writer are usually the ones that stand out to readers if and when they find them. So if you want to write in one of these genres that has fewer completed stories, you may well see more numbers if you can write a completed story in that genre, absolutely. But if you hate that genre, usually that comes through, and readers will kind of taste that. Having written a lot of very snarky vampire stuff, readers can pick up on that. And if they're here for the snark, great. If they're not here for the snark, it's kind of saying like, okay, well, you clearly hate this. I don't know why you're hanging out here, because we love this. So yes. Yeah, to my mind, like if you can find a spark of passion and excitement for you in a story you want to tell in a given genre, absolutely go for it. That said, the caveat for some of the smaller genres is they just don't have a huge readership. So you might write the perfect, and again, as a sci-fi writer, this kills me. You might write the perfect sci-fi story. I didn't, but I aspire to. And readers might, you might have some readers who love it, but there just aren't enough there to get those big numbers that you're looking for.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, before you commit a bunch of time to trying to game the system to try and find a place where that works, just make sure it's a story that you want to tell, that you're passionate about and excited about. As someone put in the chat, like, write for yourself, like, absolutely.
Also very true, very true. Also, of course, the sprint ended, as per the little
auto
thing
everybody.
at the bottom here.
The sprint ended. Congratulations. If you wrote anything at all, you have more words than you did when you started, which doesn't sound like a huge achievement, but it literally is. It is so damn hard to write right now in this time. So even just attempting to get some words down on paper is a huge achievement, and you should be legit very excited about it. If you do have some word counts, feel free to pop them in here. I'm seeing a couple people point out multiple genres. Also, like, don't be afraid to write in multiple genres. I've written romance, I've written horror, I've written sci-fi, and they're all super fun and fun for different reasons. But again, find that spark in whatever genre you're writing in, because the readers will absolutely notice that and will be attracted to it. It's always awesome when you pick up that story where you're like, oh, this writer was having so much fun. Yeah. Even if it's like super bleak.
So very true. Yeah, very true.
And I'm seeing, Yvonne got 305 words.
305.
That's awesome.
A good number.
Great work.
Yeah, it's a great number already.
Awesome. So take 5 minutes to have a little brain break. You can grab some water, you can grab some coffee or some tea.
Listen to us continue to answer this question.
And you can continue to listen to the answer of this question. So Nick, that's my take on it. What's your take on it, sir?
Mine isn't dissimilar. I would certainly, I think, like, if you're the type of person who feels really confident in different genres, you like remarkably different genres. So the difference between like fantasy and paranormal, or fantasy and sci-fi even, is not as remarkable usually as like the difference between sci-fi and romance, I think, or contemporary and any sort of speculative fiction, basically. I think if you go down that, that path and you really can write in multiple genres, then you can start to consider this more. But otherwise, yeah, I would echo yours of like, if you're good at a specific type of writing and a specific type of genre, you should probably do that more than force yourself to write something you don't really love. People can tell. There's nothing like humans hate more than someone being disingenuous. They can tell. Like if we came in here and said very corporate speak, Wattpad words, it would go over very poorly. So we have to be ourselves here, basically. And you have to be yourself the same way whenever you write your stories. If you just love sci-fi and you're a sci-fi writer, you have to look at that and say, like, I'm going to write more sci-fi content. So my advice on this one is basically I don't have an answer, which is not great. The thing for me is, like, they're both just choices, and you just understand the size of what you're getting into. So if you pick a big popular genre, you're going up against more competition. So you are competing against way more stories at once than what you're currently competing against. So it's harder, but your potential for audience is much higher. Whereas if you go into a smaller genre, your potential for audience is much lower, and the likelihood of becoming bigger is much lower. But you have less competition, so you can generally try to like rise above within that competition. And it really depends on what you want to do there. I have written in multiple different genres, and it can be really like debilitating, I guess, to look at the sci-fi story that I wrote that's very niche, very adult-oriented, very me. Like, I write it entirely for me. I'm the only audience I'm writing it for. And it is, I don't know, it has like 30 parts, somewhere around like 90,000 words by now. And it has, I think, like 2,000 reads, which is great. I mean, it's unfinished, so that's on me. And then right next to it is like my 10-part romance story that I'm writing fully for fun and just like goofing around with romance. And it also has 2,000 reads, even though it's a third of the size. And like, that sucks. That sucks that my sci-fi story that I like poured my soul into, basically, and I'm so proud of, isn't even close to as popular as the story that I just like write for the hell of it. So, but that's the trade-off that I make. I knew that going into writing that story, and I was kind of curious with the romance one, like how well it would do, and I had to pick a different angle within romance, write about a different thing in order to try to outcompete. But I view it more as a choice. Like if you're going in and you're going to go into sci-fi, there's a chance that you can have 1 million reads. I have a 1 million read sci-fi story. The chat referenced Crystal. She has a 1 million read sci-fi story. But more likely, you're gonna achieve 1 million reads in a romance story. But also at the same time, less likely because you're competing against so many other. They're just like equal trade-offs in that sense. I kind of view them equally. So I think you should consider other factors. There we go. There's our timer, so I can start the next sprint again.
ZOMG.
Did that so perfectly.
Yeah, amazing. End of the answer, beginning of the sprint. Do that dramatic thing people do in movies where you sweep everything off your desk so you got more room to write. Pick your laptop back up off the floor where you knocked it off in the big sweep. Put it back on your desk and start typing. You got this. I believe in you.
Furious typing.
Yeah.
Most furious typing. Let me switch to our other question then, now that we answered that one. So,
yeah.
I will bring up your other question. It's much smaller. It says, how do you start a story? There you go. Take us away, Tom.
Amazing. So this is, Nick and I were talking to each other after the Great Wattpad Speaks event I was going to say a few days ago, but that may have been 2 weeks ago. Yeah, I don't know. Time. What is time? And one of the questions we saw kind of repeated in the chat by a bunch of people is, how do I start my story? And I think for a lot of writers, that can either be a very easy answer, which is just like, I felt like I had to write, so I just sat down and immediately started typing, or some weirdo in a hat was like yelling at me to sprint during a live stream, so I just started typing. Totally viable options. But sometimes, even if that is the reason you start, often that's just an instinct. And one of the things we're going to be doing on the show is trying to make some of the things that are implicit explicit. The example that I always use for this sort of stuff is airline pilots do all of the checks every single time. They may have done the job. They may have flown, 1,000 flights. They know the plane like the back of their hand. They're experts in the back of their hand, so like they really know that plane.
Oh, yeah.
But they still have to run all of the checks. And the reason for that is to make sure that all of the things that they've internalized are made explicit, that they are acknowledging all of these important safety steps to make sure they never fall into that realm of just like, I'm sure it's fine. As writers, we have a lot of those habits as well. Now, it's usually not as literally life or death as an airline pilot, but
It is for
in
the
a lot of
fictional
ways.
characters.
Well, there you go. Yeah, yeah. If it's a stranger than fiction scenario where Will Ferrell's going to show up and yell at you for trying to kill him all day, like it's worth knowing these things. Um, but the important thing for me from a development lens is that we talk about these sorts of things that seem very basic and very rudimentary so that we can better understand them. And as a result, we can have better mastery over them. If you're just doing these things by instinct, you may be very good at them, but if you run into a problem, you won't necessarily know how to solve it because you've never examined what the actual skill is. Whereas if you've examined that skill, when you run into those problems, you can kind of reverse engineer your own process without us, which is great because we're not around all the time. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And basically, again, none of these rules are universal. There's literally no right or wrong when it comes to this sort of stuff. It's whatever works for you. But from where we're sitting, this is kind of how we unpack it. And these are the important questions that we think you should ask. And from the stories we've seen be most successful, these are the kinds of things that are very present in those stories. So we're going to go over that. And then I see we've got some questions popping up in the chat. So we'll try and get to those if we
feel
have time.
free. Ask away in here.
Yes,
if it's about starting your story, if it's relative to... Hang on, I got this. If it's relative to this... Oh, it's because I have a side camera. This is so much harder than it needed to be. Where would the angle have to... Oh, there we go. Okay, if it's relevant to this, you can ask it over here. There. Now we got it.
Great. First try. So let's talk about how to start your story. So to my mind, there are three major questions that you need to answer when you're sitting down to write your story. And one of them is one that I don't hear spoken about nearly enough. So we're going to spend a hot second on that. And then we'll unpack all of these as we go. So first and foremost, what is your story about? Which is generally referring to the plot or the story itself. The second one is who does it involve? This is, of course, the characters, both the main characters and the sort of side cast, just the various people you're going to need to tell your story. For my mind, the single most important one, and the one that is often overlooked, is who is this for? So we're talking about audience. In my practice, I come from theater, from a theater background, and I spent a lot of time working with playwrights, and generally speaking, there's no money in theater. So when you're putting together these plays, the argument we always made, we're up here in Canada, so we're trying to convince people who can sit at home with Netflix, Wattpad, video games, the internet, all of the entertainments that have ever existed in the world. We're asking them to leave their house in the middle of winter, trek down to some hole-in-the-wall theater to see a play they've never heard of and pay 4 times their Netflix price to see it. It has to really speak to them for them to make that journey. Or they're our friends and we guilted them. But since we wanted to move beyond that, the whole goal was like, how do we make this so enticing to an audience that they can't help but strap on all their winter gear and slush all the way down to our stupid theater to see our little play? I would argue that Wattpad is a similar ecosystem. It is so easy to not read a story on Wattpad. There are so many stories, and as a result, and because, particularly if we're talking about free stories, it's so easy to just click out of things in the same way we do on, say, Netflix or Amazon or any of the streaming services, that it's super, super important to be very clear in your intent about who the story is for.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to unpack that in larger detail a little bit later on, but it's something worth considering right from the very beginning of your idea. So speaking of that beginning, let's talk about the what. So where I like to start with this sort of stuff, and I think where you tend to start, even if you're not consciously thinking of it, is there's a spark of something that captures your interest or your imagination. This can be a character, it can be an experience, it can be a moment, it can be a story arc, a twist. It can be a scene that you have in your head. Just, oh, I really want to write about X. So that's an important impulse to train. When your brain catches on one of those things that's kicking around the back of your head as you're washing dishes or having a shower, that you just can't quite shake. That generally means that your brain has found something there that is interesting to it, rather. It can be something that makes you mad. It can be something that is unfair or infuriating or upsetting. Something that is just, again, one of those ideas that echoes around in your head when you're not really thinking about it. And sometimes you'll know right away, this is exactly what I want to write my story about. Sometimes it'll be in response to a genre. I want to write sci-fi. Well, what's interesting about sci-fi to me? So first of all, learn to capture those moments. And when you're trying to figure out what to write about and how to start, you can go back and review those, just looking at kind of that box of ideas you've got that have captivated your imagination in some way, shape, or form. It can also be interesting to consider what is interesting to you right now. What are you watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to? What are the sorts of things that you're, particularly right now in kind of difficult times, what are the sorts of entertainments you're turning to? Part and parcel with that, and one of the ways you can help ascertain your audience is, what are your friends watching and listening to? What is the internet going crazy about on any given day? Most recently, and I mean the cycle on these things is very quick right now, but Mandalorian, Bridgerton, WandaVision was kind of the big three in a row, where suddenly news sites were talking about it, pundits were making jokes about it, people were angry about spoilers, people were hungry for more. It's worth considering what those sorts of things are, because sometimes those can be an indication of what people are excited about in any given moment. Now, it isn't always going to be true. Chasing trends can be very hard. So I'm certainly not suggesting, oh, Bridgerton is popular, so I should drop my horror story and just try and write a Regency romance. Because by the time you're done in 6 months, it may not be the hot thing anymore. That's totally fine. I think instead what we're looking for is, okay, people are really digging Bridgerton right now. What is it about Bridgerton? If I'm watching it, what am I enjoying about this? And starting to kind of view the content you're consuming and enjoying through that writer lens. Because those are the sorts of things, I think, that are a little bit more evergreen than just trying to chase the most exciting thing that just happened. It's instead saying, well, what is it about that exciting thing that really worked? And is there something I can draw from it? And that, again, if you consider what the internet is talking about, what your friends are talking about on Wattpad, where the comments are, what are people really like going all in on comments about, those are some indicators about what audiences in that specific genre and niche might be interested in. Using my earlier example, what people who love The Mandalorian like might not be applicable to what people from Bridgerton like. I watched both of them, so just give me both. That's fine. You want to put Grogu in Bridgerton? I'll watch it. It'll be a delight. But generally speaking, figuring out what works for the audience you're aiming for is better than just kind of trying to write for everyone. Because it would be lovely if everyone could enjoy your work. And there are certain works that have transcended genre and interest that everyone can read and just love. That's awesome. It's also the exception, not the rule. And given kind of our exceptional individual narrative that we tend to have in the West here, it's hard not to consider ourselves the exception, but 9 times out of 10, we aren't. We're the rule. So again, think about who you're writing for, and then relink that to your idea. So if audiences are interested in blank, what about the idea that I had would be interesting to them? And start teasing that out. Also, I apologize if you hear little weird noises in the back. My dog is having dreams. It's adorable, but also slightly disruptive.
Well, this is all people are going to want now. You're just going to have to give the people what they demand at some point.
No, I understand. She's far away though, but yeah, just imagine an adorable dog dreaming, and it'll get that. She'll probably
change the whole thing.
She'll probably chime in from time to time with some barks as well, because she's cool like that.
That's all good. I mean, there's a strong discussion going on the side here too.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
That we will get to.
Once you've got an idea that you're interested in, it's time to consider who you need to tell the story. So we have seen everything from too few characters to too many characters here at Wattpad, and I'm sure you have too, in books you've written or read, where suddenly you're like, oh, I have so many names and cast members, and I really don't need this many people. So an early thing you can do to help with that is to just consider, in bare minimum, who do you need to tell the story? It can be something as simple in, say, a traditional crime fiction as, we need a victim, we need a killer, and we need a detective. At the end of the day, if we just had those 3 people, we could tell a detective story. Victim is murdered, killer tries to hide it, detective solves the case. That's really all you need. Now, of course, that would be a boring, boring story, but at its absolute core, those are the characters we need. From there, you can figure out, for the example of the detective story, if those 3 characters are necessary but aren't interesting, what else do we need to add? In traditional mystery fiction, it's usually, okay, well, who's the red herring? Who is the, if you're looking at hard-boiled or noir, the femme fatale. There's all those sorts of pieces. Now, you can tell a story with 1 character. Like, don't get me wrong, there's no limit to how few characters you can have. But often, as you'll all know, one of the joys of prose is you can bring in as many people as you want because you don't need to pay them, which is great. Unlike film and TV, where every additional person is an additional paycheck and a bit of a nightmare. But the reason I'm talking about kind of boiling it down to the absolute fewest characters necessary is that will help guide you as you continue to build your story out and eventually edit it. If your story starts to get bloated, you can always lean back on, okay, but who's the story actually about? I might think that the best friend who is having an affair, which is really complicating how he gives me relationship advice, but like his boyfriend doesn't know. Like that's all fine. But if you get to that point, usually in like three-quarters of the way through your story, where pardon me, you've just got a headache from like, oh god, I have so many characters, I don't know what to do with them anymore. Think about who it's actually about, who's important, and go back to them. If you know who that is, you'll always have that in your back pocket, and it's an absolutely great tool.
Yeah, that's a fair
Um,
point. I hear that. I get that question like all the time around. Get a lot of like. I put a lot of advice around a singular main character that I'm just like every story is about somebody and that person going through some sort of change is kind of my motto, or not changing even though they should. It's very obvious they should have changed, but they don't. But for the most part, for me, I'm like every story is about someone going through a change, and usually the response I get from people is like, "But what if I have two main characters?" And I have to always just be like, "You really don't though. Like check." You'll find ultimately like one of them speaks to you more than the other or says something, and like that one is the one whose like plot has to finish. Basically, that is the only plot that has to finish. That friend with the unresolved affair on the side can technically not finish. People might be frustrated because they'd just be like, "Where did that plot line go?" But that's also usually those additional plot lines are what open up to like that's a future sequel or that's a whole other area to explore. But like people will be definitively mad if the actual original character does not have like a closure to their arc basically. So you have to, and that's who it should start with as well. It's just like who is the main person. If you meander around about all these other characters who are not going to have that final arc, because the reader when they read it is just like they're very fast. They're just like, who do I care about? Is it this person? Is it how about is it should it be this one? Who's the like camera on center first is all that anyone is ever thinking. Just like who's it on first? Who's it on first? That's who I'll care about. And so if you don't open on that kind of person or really focus in on that person right away, people will just be very frustrated. They'll be like, where's the tell me who the main is so I can just get into this story and follow along. So that's who you want to really focus in on is just like who is that one person as you're saying. And then add on okay, and who's the other like couple of people who are tertiary or secondary, I guess, who we definitely need. Like if it's a mystery story, it needs to be about the detective. Let's use it from that angle. Or it needs to be about the killer. Those are two very different style mystery stories, right? Even though most people will be like, they're both main characters. I'm like, they are not. One of them can be the main character of one and the other, and they're very different. Chasing a serial killer versus like Dexter, which is about the serial killer. And it has a detective in it, but like they're not the main character, and that whole story is very different all around.
Yeah, there's I think as writers it can be hard when we create characters we're excited about and that our readers are excited about to acknowledge that they aren't the main character, because it feels like we're in a way like cheating them out of the spotlight. The most basic example for me.
Hang on, the sprint ended too. We're gonna call out the sprint ending.
Sprint ended! You did it! Congratulations!
We pause everything.
You were so good at writing that we didn't even tell you to stop because you were maybe on a roll, I hope. Take 5 minutes. You've earned it. And then we'll have one more sprint today before we're done.
Yes.
On future episodes, we'll be starting the sprints right out of the gate, so you'll get 3 solid ones in. But today is, an exciting first attempt.
We're going to come basically right on time to 5.
Oh, great. Oh, I like it. So Star Wars is a great example of this. I'm a huge nerd, surprise. But Star Wars is Luke Skywalker's story. There are a lot of other characters that are amazing. And that are more interesting than Luke Skywalker and have honestly more interesting emotional journeys than Luke Skywalker. But it's still the story of Luke Skywalker. He's our way in. The entire world has to be explained to him, and it's his arc that we're tracking. That doesn't make Princess Leia's arc any less interesting. It's amazing. She handles so much grief without blinking an eye. It's wild. But it's still at the end of the day Luke's story,
I have the example for this.
I'd love to hear.
I'm gonna call out some people. I don't know if they're in this chat. I don't know if you're currently watching people. I may directly call some people out here, but like, I know this is a very explicit experience on Wattpad. People who love side characters. This is very normal to like love the side character more than the main character, and is so common among especially teenagers or people who grew up with this. People who are really into like anime and manga that had that like really cool older brother type character or veteran warrior type who's just like his aesthetic is really cool. He knows all the moves. He always shows up and just like blows everyone away, and you're just like, man, that character is so cool. I want to write a whole book just about them. And then they do, and it doesn't work, right? Like, it's about what's it like. Naruto stories about Naruto, not about the super cool ninja who are already adults who are watching him. Even though you're like, but that guy's so cool. Like, he shows up and he's just like, oh man, that's amazing. I think about all the stuff that came out of which one was it? Final Fantasy VII had this problem with Cloud, and then there was the vampire guy, Vincent, I think his name is.
Vincent, yep.
With the golden hand that everyone was like, but he's just so cool. I want to write about him. He's so much cooler than the other main character.
The cinematic version of this is Jack Sparrow in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. He's a great side character, but you don't actually want him for a full movie. And when they shifted gears, everyone was like, "Oh no,
it's not good. It doesn't work." But there's so much of that on Wattpad I see where people are just like, "All right, this time I'm gonna write the one that's like just about the cool character because that's the character I love the most." And it's very like, yeah, I get that you love them. I do too. They are definitely the coolest character. But like, part of what makes these side characters so great a lot of the times is like how little you actually see of them, or that you get to fill in the blanks, or that they just show up, but they're not really what you're connected to. They're also usually like, especially when they're overpowered or ridiculous, like Jack Sparrow, like can't die, can basically do whatever, and is always a jerk at all times. It's just like not fun when it's an hour and a half of Jack Sparrow doing that compared to like 5, 6, 7 scenes in a movie. That's pretty fun. He shows up and like does goofy stuff and so on. So that is a whole other piece to just be like, I know that those other ones are fun, but like, maybe don't do that.
Yeah. So. And so all this to say that understanding who that main character is, and also understanding who your readers are going to gravitate towards, and understanding how to manage that, vitally important. And as a lot of people are indicating in the chat, absolutely, like Wattpad, again, because you're not paying to publish each of these stories, perfect place to spin off new side stories, spin-offs, prequels, sequels. There's so much room for that. And your audience will tell you. I've seen a few people here saying like the people are so interested that they wanted more. You can do that. That's totally fair. But it's important also to remember that you don't break the story you're trying to tell to accommodate that.
Yes.
And actually, this is probably a good... we're going to talk about this in a minute, but a very good thing to keep in mind forever about audiences. It's absolutely worth understanding what your audience likes and dislikes, understanding the tropes of the genre you're telling and for that story. Tropes also is a term we're going to throw around a lot. I'm going to define it almost every time we do. Tropes are just common things we see over and over and over again, so much so that we can put a label on them, and that label is tropes. A common trope in romance, for instance, would be characters have broken up. One of them is going to the airport, and the lover manages to catch them just as they're about to go onto a plane. That's a common trope in romance. It happens all over the place. So much
super relevant since 9/11. It's always been great to see the
where people could just there you go. That's people going through security, hitting the beach.
I shall start the next sprint.
Start your sprint. And yeah, tropes will change over time, absolutely. But they're common things. They're worth knowing, and they're worth either subverting or just embracing. If you're going to be a tropey story, be that tropey story, and it's just the best. The mid ground is where it gets rough. If you're including tropes without necessarily knowing they're tropes, that can be a problem. But if you're subverting them or leaning into them, great. All that to say,
this is really hard to explain to people too.
It is, and I'm going to spend literally the rest of this series explaining it over and over and over again.
Don't
worry if you think it's yes. So the other piece to this, though, is that there's a very fine line that you, as a writer, need to be very aware of between what an audience wants and what an audience needs. Particularly on Wattpad, what an audience wants, man, they will tell you. They will tell you hard. And they do, right? I saw a comment in here about killing off the love interest and having people be super upset. I totally get that. It's because they care, and that's awesome. If you listen to them, then that character would just magically survive, and the story wouldn't be satisfying. So it's important to acknowledge... the example I usually use is something like The Walking Dead, where it's like, okay, there's zombies chasing our main characters around. Ideally, what an audience wants is for our characters to live happily ever after. What we need is for them to get constantly attacked by zombies. Otherwise, the story gets real boring.
Yes.
All that to say, be aware of that. And as a writer, it's kind of up to you to decide what you're going to carry and what you're going to own. As a writer, you can go, actually, you know what? I think my readers might be right. I think I was just swinging for the fences, going for like a big twist, and maybe we don't need it. I'm going to change it.
Yep.
Fair. Or it's also fair to be like, yeah, that is cool. It would be lovely if that person survived, but they didn't. That's the version of the story I'm telling. And honestly, Wattpad's a perfect ecosystem for this because so much of the fan fiction we see is writers saying, I wish it had played out differently. I'm going to go write that version. So, all that to say, don't be afraid to embrace tropes. Absolutely. Understand the difference between an audience need and a want, and make sure you're creating the story that you want, the one that you think works, and the one that you're willing to stand by. And if it fails, that's also totally fine. If it's the story you wanted to tell the way you wanted to tell it, that's often more satisfying than, oh, okay, I just completely changed the ending and now it's a piece of trash that I hate, but at least people are reading it. That can be good if you're after audience and fame, like also totally legit to do that. Films do it all the time. But then you also see things like the Suicide Squad movie where they just change everything and change everything and change everything to a point that it's just a weird mess of different director ideas. And everyone watching it's like, what is this? This feels like 4 movies got dumped in a bucket and shaken around and dumped back out on the table. Because that's literally what happened in that case. But that's neither here nor there. So we've talked about who. So we've got our characters. We know who our main character is. Generally speaking, always a good idea to know what's interesting about that character. How do their goals, their hopes, their dreams, and their fears intersect with the story you're trying to tell? You've decided on the kind of story you want to tell. Those characters need to interact with that story. You can have the most interesting characters in the world, but if they shouldn't be in that story, we're going to know as readers and viewers and listeners. We have
It
that
has
experience.
to be. It has to be their story, right?
Exactly right. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's fine. It's fine, for instance, in a zombie apocalypse narrative to say, okay, well, this is just a nobody. They work a bad job, like just someone from Clerks, like they work in a convenience store. They're no one special. That's totally fine. There's still a reason that you as the writer have decided that it's their story. And generally in sort of a Shaun of the Dead narrative like that, it's about an ordinary person overcoming extraordinary challenges. So there's a reason it's them. But there always has to be a reason why your characters are in the story. Because again, we're not telling real life. This isn't just, here's the people who happen to be here on this day. You've picked them. It's what a lot of painters talk about in terms of the difference between a photograph, which might be more accurate because it captures everything, and a painting has intent. You specifically decided every single element in there. Nothing happened by accident. Whereas in a photograph, you might capture something you didn't mean to. But anyway,
Very true.
that's
Very
that.
fair.
So moving on from that,
fair.
We talked a little bit about tropes, figuring out what genre your story is happening in and understanding what the major tropes of that are. There can be some fun in subverting tropes, but also be careful. Emma, who some of you may know at Wattpad, is a staunch romance fan. And we have had a number of increasingly heated arguments about whether a romance needs to have a happy ending. And that is the hill she will die on. So if you're coming into romance and you want to write a capital R romance and you're going to change that ending, be aware that that's a big thing. If you're not a huge fan of romance and you're not aware of that argument and that trope and that kind of necessity, you might just think, oh, it's cool. I'm just going to write a romance and it'll be a little bit different. In film, we saw this with Forces of Nature, as a Sandra Bullock, Ben Affleck movie where they're both on a plane that has to make an emergency landing. They're both on their way to like their weddings, but a storm forces them down. They fall in love. And at the end of the movie, they're going to leave their partners and be together. And then he goes in to break up with his fiance and then just doesn't. And Sandra Bullock just wanders off to go meet up with her fiance. And it's like an anti-ending. And that film bombed hard because everyone was there to watch these two people be in love. And I refuse a world where Sandra Bullock doesn't get a happy ending. So just be aware of what those things are, because your readers sure as hell will be. And it's fine to subvert them, but also be aware that you're going to take heat for that. So be aware of the genre you're writing in and incorporate as much of that as you want.
Very true. Very true.
And part of that can also be for you. What do you love about that genre? What's exciting to you about that that you want to tackle? But in the interest of time, I'm going to start moving a little bit faster. So on to who's it for? So consider what kind of reader will be most attracted to your story and what are their needs and wants and which ones you're going to service and which ones are you going to deny in a way that will likely create a better, more emotional experience for them, even if it frustrates them. Consider age when you're talking about audiences. The needs of a young adult novel are different from the needs of a new adult novel, which are different from the needs of an adult novel, which are different from the needs of a sci-fi novel, a fantasy novel, a horror novel, all those sorts of things. Each of these has a different need. I used to work in children's theater, so the simplest version of this is if you're writing a kid's play, don't swear in it. It's a simple, simple thing. It's very hard to do when you cuss like a sailor like I do, but it's a necessary feature of that audience. If you put swearing in your children's play, the kids are going to love it, the parents are going to be furious, and no one's going to come to your play again. So just be aware of the audience you're writing for and how to kind of give them the best experience. And to my mind, the question you should always be asking yourself is, what is the experience I'm trying to create for my reader? At the end of the day, that is the single biggest tip I can give you. It will solve most of your problems. Because you embrace that idea of I'm creating something for someone. What's the experience I want them to have? In the case of readers being mad that the love interest died, you were trying to engineer that. You were giving them a tragedy, something that would make them feel awful because this experience they were having was broken in a way. But that's the experience you were trying to create. If it was just an accidental, like, oh, didn't realize anyone cared thing. The writers of WandaVision have talked about this a lot, where there are certain twists in that series that they're like, oh, we didn't think anyone was going to embrace this as hard as they did. We're sorry. We weren't promising you that. I'm sorry you thought that's what we meant. It wasn't. Oops. So just be aware, again, of kind of what experience you're trying to create, and then doing your best to reach that. And if you get stuck, if you get writer's block, if you don't know where to go, if you don't know where to take the characters next, lean back on that. What is that experience? If hope has to triumph at the end, it doesn't matter that these characters hate each other the most right now. I need to figure out either what I need to rewrite to get them there or what I need to write next to bring them back together.
Yeah. I mean, I think we covered the who, what, where, right? Of all of it. What else we got here? Because I'm trying to think, like,
I've got,
we can get to some of these questionings over here on the side.
I'm going to burn a bunch more of these down in 2 minutes. They're
right.
super fast. So
let's get to these questionings after that, then.
Absolutely. You've got that. That's great. If you're a pantser, you probably stopped listening to this and you're already writing. If you're a planner, take all these elements, map them out, make sure all the important beats you need to get from your beginning to your end are there to create that experience. If you're a pantser, go ahead, start writing, but keep in mind, whose story is it, what is the story, and what is the experience I'm trying to create. Also, remember that you will have to do a bunch of editing, so don't try and knock it out in one. It never works, but I believe you.
You will always have to edit. There will always be editing.
The other piece that a lot of people were asking about kind of how to start a story is what happens if you just get stuck. You write like the first part and the story seems too intimidating. You can't get there. Joe Hill, who's a great horror writer, once described every short story as one scene, essentially, and every novel as a bunch of short scenes. So don't worry about trying to write the whole thing. That's a big task, and it's really scary. Everyone who's done NaNoWriMo will know this. Just punching out a few hundred words is the best possible step in the right direction. You don't need to worry about the whole thing. Just worry about what's directly in front of you. So if you can't conceive of the whole story, doesn't matter. Just write that scene. Start writing some dialogue. Start writing two characters interacting with each other and encountering a problem. Everything will come from that. And you can just take little baby steps forward. You're still moving forward. Finally, don't get too hung up on getting it right the first time. You're going to have to edit. Editing
it's always editing.
Can be very tough, but it's vital. It's so necessary. So just go for it. Just start working your way through, hacking it out. And remember, if you run into trouble, we're here. So come send us messages and stuff, and we'll help. So we've got a bunch of questions in the stream. Let's hit those.
Yeah, let me remember all the questions. Going all the way back, don't worry, Bridget, I saw you asking if dialogue-heavy stories do well on Wattpad. Not really a start of story question, so we'll kind of skip it, but it's a thing to get to later. I'm gonna give the quick answer that is not the answer, but is not the correct answer, but is the correct answer, which is yes, they do. Not necessarily because people love dialogue. It's more generally speaking, stories on Wattpad are a little faster than what's in traditional publishing, and that does tend to be a function of the dialogue that people are using. People like a lot of that discussion. People connect with it really, really well. So yes, dialogue-heavy stories will do somewhat better than very dense prose-heavy stories that feature very little character interaction. Generally don't do as well. Something to that effect. So we covered that one. Okay. People asked about tropes. You covered some of this stuff. So you gave your answer on utilizing the tropes, finding that gray area balance that's very difficult to
If I could
describe
just
to people.
quickly
Yeah, go for it.
tropes and also starting with cliches debate. So Deanna from Books has always said, like, be very careful about your opening, and I could not agree more. You may know that soon, 2 pages from now, something amazing is going to happen that'll hook everyone forever. But as readers who have very limited attention span and little time these days, we will drop the second we taste something we don't like. We're not going to stick around and hope it gets better because there are other stories we can find.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of cliche openings here. Honestly, my advice is if you can recognize it as a cliche opening, just don't do it. Also feel free.
That's
It's just a suggestion.
I'm there with you.
Generally speaking, the thing to remember, and this is a difficult one to wrap your head around, because you've imagined the whole world, but keep in mind that your opening few lines, we have a blank slate in our heads, and those are the lines that are helping us to create the world and helping us decide whether or not we want to hang out in this world and whether this world is interesting to us. You may have a fully fleshed out cool fantasy realm in your head, but if we start with a dream sequence, I don't know about any of that. And the reason dream sequences piss so many people off is we're still trying to form our idea of what your world is and your story is. And if it's a dream sequence, you immediately pull the rug out from under us and say, actually, it's not that. And I've just spent a bunch of time and energy building that in my head. So the minute you say, actually, it's not that, it's this, I'm like, no.
No fake outs.
You had a chance to give me the world, and instead you gave me a fake out. And as a result, I invested in that fake out, and I don't find it cute to suddenly realize that isn't it.
Yeah.
It's not to say you can't use dream sequences, but opening with them, I know
so
particularly
risky.
yeah, it's very risky. And again, you might be the exception to the rule, but I got to tell you, most times you're not.
That's what makes it, right?
Yeah, most
That's what makes
times
it the rule.
an editor will look at it and just go, no. So be very, very careful. It's not to say you can't do it, but be very, very intentional with it. It has to serve a really important purpose. And the question ends up being, you may really like that opening that you've crafted that has cliches. Consider, though, is it worth the cost of losing the reader just to keep it? Because I've had to cut a lot of stuff I passionately love for my stories, but it's to serve a greater purpose, which is I know my readers will stick around. So
Yes.
that's my thumbnail on that.
Yep.
Sorry, take it away.
No, you got all of it basically for me. I mean, like, the thing for me with cliches is how I would put this is like meta cliches, good. The ones that people use, like enemies to lovers, great cliche, love it. Mwah, chef's kiss, all that, like terrific cliche. Isekai, into another world's great cliche. Meta cliches, everybody loves them. That's why we keep going back to them. They're great storytelling machines. Technical cliches as your opener, not good. Technical cliches being like starting with the sun in the sky and then panning down, or a character opens by waking up, right? Or describing themselves in the mirror so that you hear the description of the character. All that kind of stuff, those kind of like technical cliches that you know them as individual phrases or sentences, they don't go over well as openings. Meta cliches, totally fine. Like, you should not be mad because you're very good at writing friends to lovers and all your stories end up being that way. Like, I'm sure there's people who love friends, believe me, people who love friends to lovers do not care that they're reading their like 20th consecutive friends to lovers story. They have no issue with the fact that they're reading more friends to lovers. Like, no problem with any of that kind of stuff. So I think like that's a huge piece. And Deanna's point is super correct. I'm data guy. You bring me on this show for the data. I can tell you that when we evaluate content, we spend more time with that content than the average reader does, because we understand, okay, maybe they're a little slow to get up to it. The average reader, you have less than 30 seconds to convince them your story is worth something. So if you are saying, wait until chapter 2 is when it really takes off, that's now chapter 1. Chapter 5 is when the story really gets going, that's now chapter 1. Because readers do not have the time for that. They have so many choices and so many thousands of stories out there. Why would they stop at yours when they haven't been sold on it, right? Like, no one has convinced them that this is totally worth reading yet. And you can't... The thing that I've always used as a visual for people is, like, I want you to imagine you walk into a bookstore and there's an author just, like, sitting in a chair next to their book. And every person who goes by, they're like, no, but you should read mine. And, like, really stick through it, because halfway through it gets really good. Nobody does that. You would not listen to that, obviously. You'd just be like, go away, leave me alone. Just make your book start where it's good or interesting or any of that kind of stuff. So I think that's just a huge piece that like you can't work on this notion that people will buy into the story just because you really love it because you see what's later. It just
And
generally doesn't happen.
so just to tag on to this opening cliche bit, there's a question later in the chat about um, dialogue. Also from Deanna, hard no on opening with dialogue.
On
I do it
opening with dialogue.
all the time. But her point, which I think is fair, is again, if we think about the reader's brain, and again, this is a piece that I'm always going to bring back because I think it's the key to everything. When you think about a reader's brain, I don't know anything about your world or your story. So an opening line of and as a playwright, I want to open with dialogue because it's what I know and I can write really punchy lines. But the reader has no context. So in their head, that line happens in a complete blank void. Like I'm talking like Looney Tunes, we ran off the edge of the world, white space with just a single line floating in it. We don't know who it is, where they are, what's going on. The line might be intriguing, but again, then you're starting to deal with this is a weird concept, but one we'll talk about a lot, which is reader disappointment, which is I read that line, I immediately fill in the gaps and imagine who I think could have said that line. And if it isn't that person, I'm going to feel just a little bit disappointed. I might not consciously register it, but if it's like, freeze, everybody, hands to the skies, and I'm like, oh no, is it a bank robbery? And then it turns out it's just a kid with a broom. I'm like, that's less interesting than what I had. And then I'm
That's a
cranky
mini
because,
fake out.
yeah,
It's a
but then I'm
mini
cranky
fake out.
because the thing I invented in my head, which is completely unfair to the writer, but the thing I invented in my head didn't happen, so now I'm mad at you. It's real dumb, but it happens all the time.
Yeah.
So my recommendation is give us one, it can be a single line to establish where we are. In that case, it could be something as simple as like, the bandit raised their weapon, reach for the skies. Okay, it's a kid or what have you. Like you can still do that. You can still have that little fake out moment if you want. But again, it's just something to ground us. Something that just like lets us go, cool, I know where I am. Hit me with those cool lines. Also, I'm seeing, so we're at time. So we're going to wrap this up.
Yeah, and also congrats to everyone for ending the
Yeah, I
sprints.
was going to say, I'm seeing like Yvonne got 272 this time. Words on the page, right? Yeah, absolutely words on the page. That's awesome.
Brianna got 605.
605. That's awesome. Awesome. And if you haven't written a word because you've been listening, that's super cool too. Something to consider about all of this and all of these is a lot of the time, we have so little time to write as writers, let alone read and do anything else, that it can be very hard to carve out time to think about craft and to think about where you're going when you could be writing. So I want to thank you personally for taking the time today to listen to this. It was time you could have spent writing, but it was instead time you came to kind of listen and think about your craft. To my mind, that is writing time. And you may not have had your fingers on the keyboard or a pen in your hand or a quill if you're super cool like that, or a typewriter like Jessica Fletcher, my most favorite literary character. That it doesn't matter. What matters is this is part of your writing process. Thinking about these things, asking these questions, learning from each other is part of your writing process. So you spent time writing today, even if you physically didn't get anything down on the page, because you were here thinking about it. And again, I want to thank you for putting your trust in us, that we would have things worth your time. I sincerely hope it was.
Did we have things worth their time? You're making them question us here at the end.
That's right, because I'm in the reader's head. But all that to say, this is going to be a weekly tradition. You will see some changes to it as we go. We're going to make it look bright and shiny as time goes on, but we wanted to make sure it didn't explode or break. Thank you so much for the nice comments here. I've got people saying thanks. Thank you for the people who are writing. Thank you also for everyone who is giving each other advice in the chat. Everyone here, I think, knows how lonely writing can be. And one of my favorite things about this community and the site is that it's a little less so here. So I hope you all have a great weekend. We'll be back next week. If you do have questions, check out the Google form that you found wherever you found this. I will make sure to put it in the description for StorySights as well. And yeah, we'll be back unpacking more questions next week and running more sprints. So till then, happy writing. You got this. I believe in you. Have a good one.